In this section of the presentation, we will be talking about self-care and mental health practices for both employees and employers. And it's our hope by the end of this section, you will be able to define mental health and mental illnesses, identify key impacts of mental illness on businesses, and explain evidence-informed self-care practices for preventing and addressing developing mental illnesses. So substance use disorders are an example of just one mental illness. Individuals oftentimes have symptoms of a variety of different mental illnesses when they have a substance use disorder, which is also known as co-occurring disorder. So it's really important to fully understand what a mental illness is and the vast reaches that a variety of different mental illnesses can come into play when someone has a substance use disorder. The American Psychological Association defines a mental illness as health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behavior, or a combination of these. Mental illnesses are associated with distress and or problems functioning in social, work, or family activities. And mental illnesses still remain highly stigmatized in our society as well as in the workplace. However, mental illnesses are very common. So 1 in 5 adults live with a mental illness. The most common mental illnesses we see are anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, and depression. And depression is actually one of the most common mental illnesses that we see in terms of its impacts on our economy and in our workplace. So every year about $210 billion are lost as a result of depression in our economy. And this is due to decreases in productivity, absenteeism, disability, and even suicide. So it's really important that employers put a focus on supporting their employees that have mental illnesses and those that are likely to be impacted, as untreated mental illness costs your business a lot of money, and obviously the effects that can come along with untreated mental illness are tragic in of themselves, not even looking at the costs. Workplaces can also perpetuate mental illness through increased risk factors. And what I mean by this is some of the risk factors we see within businesses impacting an employee's mental health include inadequate health and safety policies, poor communication and management practices, limited participation in decision-making or low control over one's area of work, low levels of support for employees, inflexible working hours, unclear tasks or organizational objectives, and bullying and harassment. So these are all components that can be seen in some workplaces that actually perpetuate an individual's mental health disorder. Now we're gonna look at the definition for mental health, as we already went over the definition for mental illness. So the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And now we're going to look at some considerations for employees in helping them to maintain good mental health. So as quoted by Mr. Rogers, anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be better managed. So the growing prevalence of mental illness really means that we have to talk about it, and we need to be willing to meet it with empathy and action. So that's some of our big key considerations for employees is talking about your mental health, responding to colleagues' experiences and feelings with empathy, and adopting behaviors that manage stress and mental health more adequately within the workplace. And now we'll talk about some key considerations for mental health for employees that revolve around their behaviors and how they can adapt to protect against mental illness. So taking advantage of mental health benefits and services offered by your place of work is really important. They're there for a reason, so you should take advantage of them. Eating healthy meals and snacks. This goes back to that whole mind, body, soul experience. Eating healthy and making sure that you are eating are really important for maintaining your mental health. Moving your body throughout the day. So if you have a desk job and you're sitting and not really doing much with your body throughout the day, that can really impact your mental health. Sleeping 7 to 8 hours per night. I know when I don't get the right amount of sleep, it just really impacts me. I tend to be, more tired and just have a more negative outlook. So when you sleep the suggested amount a night, it really can benefit your mental health and put you into a more positive space. Build and nurture face-to-face relationships, so making sure that you have those positive relationships, not just outside of work, but inside of work as well. People that you can talk to at work, that you can have a relationship with at work. And reducing time spent on gossiping. Gossiping and negative talk puts us in a really negative headspace, so projecting that positivity and avoiding gossiping is really important. Spending time reflecting on what's going right, so projecting that positivity, not just sitting in what's going wrong with your day, but also noticing this actually went really well for me today, or this is something positive that happened today, can really switch your headspace. And taking available time off. As employees, we're given time off for a reason, and it's so that we can use it. So if you have available time off and you can take it for your mental health, we do recommend that you do that, just so that you can maintain that positive headspace. And now we're gonna look at some ways that employers can support mental health. So a couple ways to do this is by prioritizing and talking about mental health. So providing trainings like this to your employees is really important, as well as perpetuating that messaging through your practices. Providing or facilitating access to affordable insurance that covers comprehensive mental health services can be really beneficial. Developing and enforcing anti-bullying and anti-harassment policies. We know if someone's feeling really attacked or vulnerable at work, like they're not accepted, that really goes home with you at night and can really impact your mental health. So if anybody comes forward reporting any type of bullying or harassment, that should be taken very seriously, and policies should be built around that to ensure that when that does occur and if that does occur, those situations are handled appropriately. And then encouraging your staff to utilize available mental health services. So, just having the services there or the time off for mental health there is one thing, but to hear your management or your leadership team enforcing that you encourage people to take that time off to focus on their mental health or use these services for their mental health can really be the push that somebody needs to actually utilize those services. And other considerations for employers, continuing on, I just touched on encouraging staff to take available time off, involving your employees in decision making. When people feel like they're bought into what you're doing and like they have autonomy over themselves and they're able to make those decisions, that puts a real positive spin on an individual. Modeling and instituting practices that promote healthy work-life balance. And programs for career development of employees. So it can cause an employee to be in a really negative headspace if they feel like they're stuck on this hamster wheel where there's no opportunity for growth or advancement. So having those little areas where maybe an employee can shine brighter or show some more of their skill sets can really make all the difference for an employee and make their mental health that much more positive. And then recognizing and rewarding the contributions of employees. So if an employee does step forward and does do something that is really beneficial or highlights a skill that you didn't know that employee had, making sure that you recognize that and reward them for that contribution and that extra effort is really important. And now we're going to go into section C of this presentation. Our final topic is about trauma in the workplace. I do want to advise everybody, just before we go any further, that some of the things that we will be talking about in this section can evoke feelings for individuals, especially if you have experienced trauma. So we welcome everyone to care for themselves as they best see fit through this section of the training. So it's our hope by the end of section C that you will be able to identify key characteristics of trauma, identify potentially traumatizing and re-traumatizing workplace conditions, and identify specific practices employers can implement to address trauma in the workplace. So we'll start off by defining trauma, and what we're talking about when we speak about trauma is this definition here: a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or physical injury. And trauma often occurs in a cycle. What we mean by this is that an event will occur, or a series of events, or a circumstance occurs that is traumatic for an individual. And that experience was likely physically or emotionally harmful or even life-threatening, and that's what makes it traumatic. And then that experience has lasting adverse effects on that individual's ability to function. And this can be a result of mental, physical, and emotional or spiritual well-being being impacted as a result of that trauma. And so the way that this turns into a cycle is that, say that the original traumatic event that occurred was a result of screaming or yelling. And you go through this whole, you're negatively impacted, you were emotionally harmed, there's a lasting effect on you, and your mental and emotional well-being was impacted by that screaming or yelling. And then an event occurs where somebody else is screaming and yelling. That's going to put you through this whole trauma cycle again, and it's actually going to result in built-up traumas, meaning that you now have the original traumatic event that occurred with the screaming and yelling that traumatized you, and then you have this re-traumatization where you're going through a similar event with screaming and yelling, and you're going through all the same feelings again, but it's even more so than the first time. So that's what we mean when we say a cycle of trauma, and this is really important for employers and employees to recognize, because there are things that can occur in the workplace that might cause this cycle of trauma to occur again. So, there are times when we lose our temper, and bosses sometimes can yell or scream, or a coworker can get upset. And if someone already has felt a level of trauma around an event like that, that could actually cause this cycle of trauma to occur again and add to their level of trauma. So it's important to recognize this and understand how it impacts somebody's mental health. And now we'll just go over some common indicators of trauma at the emotional, physical, cognitive, and behavioral level. So some signs of trauma at the emotional level might include numbness and emotional detachment, anxiety or severe fear, and guilt, including survivor's guilt. And then what you might see physically as a result of trauma is sleep disturbances, nightmares, lowered resistance to colds and infections, so you're just getting sick easier, and then persistent fatigue. At the cognitive level, you might see intrusive memories or flashbacks, strong identification with victims, or have a level of self-blame around that trauma. And then behaviorally, you might see an individual taking part in self-harm or high-risk activities, difficulty expressing themselves. I know for me, if I'm trying to talk about something that I went through with a trauma, I actually will tend to shut down first before I can actually talk to that. So difficulty expressing oneself can definitely be an indicator. And then increased use of alcohol and other drugs. So this ties back in that whole idea that the individuals with a substance use disorder oftentimes are working through other mental illnesses as well. It's not just that substance use disorder, although that can be the case, but there is often co-occurring disorders occurring. And now we're going to talk about some of the major drivers of trauma. Experiencing a substance use disorder is often a result of a trauma. They're trying to self-medicate, not necessarily knowing how to work through that trauma. Chronic mental illnesses can be a result of experiencing a traumatic event. And then physical illness can be a result of experiencing a traumatic event. So if you're not getting enough sleep and your immune system is suppressed, it can definitely impact you physically. And then even early deaths. So there's been a lot of research around individuals with that have experienced higher levels of trauma, and those that have experienced higher level of trauma are more likely to die at a younger age. And now we'll go over some stressors and events that could occur in the workplace that could result in some trauma, just so employees and employers are aware of this. So some traumatic stressors that might occur in the workplace include chronic pressure. If you're feeling really pressured to get a job done, or there's a high level of pressure within that workplace, that can really impact someone's mental health and actually be traumatic. Harassment or bullying we already touched on. Unresolved conflict, so if there's some fighting going on or some disagreements in the workplace and those aren't addressed, that can increase your stress level really high if you're going into that environment every day, and that can cause trauma. Noise, if there's a lot of noise somewhere, and sense of no control over your space. So if it's really hectic and crazy and you feel out of place and you don't really know what you're supposed to be doing, that can be a traumatic stressor as well. And then traumatic events that can occur in the workplace include a coworker suicide, injury to yourself or to a coworker, if an accident occurs, a violent crime, assault, or evacuation. So these really big, scary events that could occur at your workplace, those can definitely have traumatic impacts on us as employees and employers. So it's important to think about all of this. If any of these traumatic stressors might be present at your workplace, it could be a good idea to maybe come up with a team to try to think of how you could address them. And if a traumatic event does occur at your workplace, which we hope it does not, but if it does, making sure that as your leadership team and management really puts a focus on addressing that trauma and not just acting like it didn't happen. Your employees definitely will be impacted, and it's important to recognize that. So employers can meet the challenges that trauma poses head-on through doing some of these considerations. So employee assistance programs that offer trauma support services. If you have an EAP and a traumatic event does occur, a lot of times they have therapists and counselors that are really well versed in this that can actually come out and help you and your team through that traumatic event. So I recommend looking into that. Peer specialists on staff are available on demand, can be really beneficial to help deal with trauma. Paid time off for employees who suffer traumatic experiences, just to give people the time to recover and handle that emotional baggage that comes as a result of trauma, rather than, like I said, just trying to return back to normal. And then revising company policy to be better trauma informed can be really beneficial. And now we'll talk about some key considerations for employers as a way of wrapping up this training. Some things that employers can think of to help have a better trauma-informed workplace. So the first one is safety. Physical and emotional safety for your staff is really important. If people aren't feeling physically or emotionally safe, then it's not only more likely that a traumatic event will occur, but it's more likely that that traumatic event will have a bigger effect on that employee. So making sure people are feeling physically and emotionally safe in their workplace is really important. Trustworthiness, so setting clear tasks, consistency, and making sure that you maintain boundaries is really important for your employees. This will ensure that they know what they're doing, they clearly understand the boundaries of that workplace, they understand how the practices of that workplace are day to day. That is one significant way of addressing trauma for an individual if they do already have trauma. Understanding what they're supposed to be doing that day is really beneficial. And then if a traumatic event does occur, having that level of trustworthiness with your employees is really great. Collaboration, so working together and sharing power when appropriate. Again, this makes people feel more bought into the organization, more important. They understand their place. And this is really great for addressing trauma. And then finally, empowerment. So encouraging employees to have a voice, to participate, and to develop and grow so that they feel they can talk about if they're going through something, and that they, again, have that place in that organization and can go to their leadership team or go to another coworker and talk about how they're feeling, whether that be as a result of a past traumatic experience that occurred or something that might occur within the workplace. So all of these 5 components are really great for having a more trauma-informed workplace, and we do encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about this study and about these 5 components, to visit the link in the left-hand side of the screen. It goes over a lot about trauma-informed workplaces, and it has a specific focus for HR departments. So if you have an HR department, this is especially beneficial, but even if you don't, it's still beneficial, and I highly suggest that you check it out. Thank you all very much for taking part in this training. I hope that you feel like you have a better understanding of mental health and self-care, as well as trauma-informed care as a result of this. And I highly recommend that you check out any of the links provided as additional resources for you.